On a hot August day in Muskogee, 1905, an assembly of tribal delegates brushed away the flies inside the Hinton Theater as the votes came in one by one. The document on the table was made up of the hopes, dreams, and promises of what would become a new state.
It was promised that we would be able to live in peace for forever and ever, as long as a river flows and grass grows and sun shines, and we would be here.
We fought the United States and realized we weren't going to win militarily, so we had to do things in order to survive as a nation.
The vote was unanimous. There would be a new state, and it would be governed by Native Americans. Next, we go back in time to see the struggle to establish the state of Sequoyah.
The extermination of the Indians and the taking of their lands was ultimately as beneficial as it was inevitable. Now, I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe 9 out of 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely into the case of the 10th. The most vicious cowboy has more moral principle than the average Indian. Theodore Roosevelt.
I think that Indians always wanted that. From the very time Columbus landed on our land, and then that's when the greed began. But we've always wanted our own place. And it was a dream, because it wasn't ever going to happen.
For people outside Indian Territory, Americans couldn't understand why we had a society in the heart of the American continent that was so un-American.
The people who came here left their land in Europe, in England, Britain. This wasn't their land. They didn't have the kind of attachment to the land that we had. It was different. It was a resource to them. To us, it was our home.
The years following the Civil War were a time of great struggle for tribes in Indian Territory. Struggles in dividing the land, struggles in keeping their possessions against ruthless and scheming invaders, and fading hopes for a state which had been promised them and their fathers.
The beginning of the Sequoyah Convention actually begins in 1866 with the Reconstruction treaties that were, if you will, negotiated with the 5 tribes after the Civil War. Almost immediately after the ink was dry on the treaty with all 5 tribes, there was a move in Congress to essentially phase out all the tribal governments and indeed blend them all into one state or one entity.
We were encouraged to set up a government and, of course, being centralized. And so we modeled this new government along the same premises or parameters that the United States government was set up on.
The Treaty of 1866 stated that the government of the United States had bound itself with the tribes never to form a state or territory from the land they occupied without their consent.
The Cherokees had their own written language. They had their own newspapers, their own Supreme Courts, their executive branches, their legislative branches, so their native law ways had already changed.
The Cherokees, the Creeks, the Seminoles, Choctaws, and Chickasaws all had established schools, all had seminaries very similar. We valued education because it was the tool that we had to have in order to survive. It was the last weapon we had against the white man.
After Reconstruction was over, you had white people who began to come into the Indian Territory, and in the later decades of the 19th century renting land, so that by 1900 you had non-Indians outnumbering Indians by far.
You know, we had a lot of people come in here, and they wanted what we had, and they were willing to do anything to get it.
At that same time, coincidentally, was the major push by the United States for railroads. And part of the stipulations in the treaty was to allow the railroads to come in. So here they were coming in and starting to bring an influx of people. And so there was a push. I felt pressure by the tribes that we need to do something to protect our realm, our area.
They wanted to be sure that a railroad was cut through each of the various tribal lands for transportation purposes. It's basically predicated on an economic and a political basis so that they could gain control of the tribal politics of each of the tribes and then set up eventually the system economically that would benefit the white man the most to the detriment of the tribes.
Then the farmers out in the countryside began to put in protests because they had no educational rights for their children. They couldn't vote. Of course, all of their complaints put aside the fact that they weren't supposed to be there in the first place.
So the argument was, well, there are more white people in these Indian nations than there are Indians, and they're not being able to go to school. They don't have any say in the government. Those were the arguments used in essence, to divest us of our nation.
The Curtis Act of 1898 was officially titled the Act for the Protection of the People of Indian Territory. In fact, it stripped the 5 civilized tribes of their communally held lands and divided it into 160-acre sections allotted to individual members of the tribes. It also abolished tribal courts and tribal governments by 1905. In return, the tribes were promised they could have a state of their own.
The Curtis Act started the clock ticking for the end of tribal sovereignty, that there would be a state by 1907. And so once that happens, they have to allot their lands in severalty. So the Dawes Commission, Jerome Commission, they're all working to do that.
It was the idea of forming our own state was seen as a way out.
Cherokee citizen James A. Norman had a vision for the new state. He called it Sequoyah after the inventor of the Cherokee syllabary. Norman laid out the benefits of a separate state, saying Indian Territory had the natural resources. It had a population that could support statehood, and compared it to Oklahoma Territory, which was in debt, suffered several years of crop failure, and was plagued with tax problems.
Indian Territory had oil, it had coal, it had timber. Farmland was good too, and so it had, economically, there was something really beneficial for Oklahoma. And Oklahoma had been interested in acquiring Indian Territory for some time.
The tribes themselves had already developed the eastern half of the state. The economy was established. The infrastructure was there.
The telephone had already come in before 1900. Newspapers were being published all over Indian Territory.
Anytime we had resources to be developed, then the white population came in and wanted it.
The construction of the two territories as one state is an impossibility, for the people out there will fight it to a standstill. There'd be no more loyal citizens than those of Indian Territory if they're admitted to the Union, but they'll never submit to the merging of the two territories. Chief Pleasant Porter.
There was all kinds of talk about statehood for Indian Territory and statehood for Oklahoma Territory, and the question out there was, is this going to be one state or is it going to be two states?
Congress at the time is strongly Republican. They do not want two more Democratic senators coming from the Indian Territory, knowing that when the rest of Oklahoma becomes a state, there are two more Democratic senators, so they don't want that. They hold the line and say, no, we want single statehood. We do not want two separate states.
When the local newspapers in Indian Territory wrote about single statehood, there were all kinds of arguments that they would use to argue against an Indian state. Everything from the size of the state was too small to the fact that it couldn't stand alone economically and so on.
We want joint statehood for Oklahoma and the Indian Territory. We're not asking it on sentiment, but on the grounds of right and justice.
A great deal is being said at this time about statehood, both by the single and double staters, but not one has ever said, let's put the matter to a vote of the Indians.
On April 5, 1905, President Theodore Roosevelt entered Indian Territory on one of his extended hunting trips in the West.
Your territory, remember, in conjunction with Oklahoma, will soon be one of the greatest states in the Union.
Theodore Roosevelt was probably more involved in the history of Oklahoma than any other president before or since. But he was a practical politician. He was head of the Republican Party at the national level. He did not want more Democratic senators, especially out of the Old South.
Theodore Roosevelt didn't intend to admit the state if he could avoid it because both territories had grown so overwhelmingly Democratic. He was a very partisan character.
Spurred on by President Roosevelt's visit, the advocates of both single and separate statehood held several meetings to forward their agenda. James A. Norman and Chiefs William C. Rogers and Green McCurtain, governors of the Cherokee and Choctaw nations respectively, issued a call for a constitutional convention to be held in Muskogee on August 21, 1905.
Well, at the time of the Constitutional Convention, Muskogee was cut by two railroads, and it would have had a very strong, thriving business district and two very strong black business districts, and it would have had a sizable population. 1904, somebody said there were more federal bureaucrats in Muskogee than in any other city in the United States outside of Washington, D.C.
There's actually three principles to the Sequoyah Convention: William H. Murray, Charles Nathaniel, Haskell, and Pleasant Porter. And Pleasant Porter was the elder statesman, the person that had the respect, like the cement, the glue that held everything together.
The convention to be held here later this month will live in history. It will live as long as there is American liberty. Chief Pleasant Porter.
He was our last freely elected chief. So he was one of the ones that saw the inevitable end of where we were going. So he had to mitigate or minimize as much of the potential damagers that was seen to maybe have come from some of these actions. And so he was in a difficult position.
Charles Haskell was a Pennsylvania oil man who had transplanted to Muskogee, and he had a statehood movement of his own going. It was an independent statehood. Independent was part of the title, and he had called a meeting in Muskogee for that same time as the Sequoyah Convention. But he saw the benefit of joining forces with the Sequoyah movement.
Chief Douglas H. Johnston, the only one of the 5 chiefs to oppose the convention, sent his nephew to represent the Chickasaws.
Alfalfa Bill Murray had married into the Chickasaw Nation. The Chickasaws probably more so than the other tribes, were very liberal on accepting others, non-Indians, as tribal citizens. So he not only married into a Chickasaw family, but he was an attorney from Texas who knew constitutional law. And the chief of the Chickasaw says, "You will be my delegate to the state of Sequoyah."
There was no question in his mind it was going to be William H. Murray, because he was the right man at the right place at the right time.
I had spent 4.5 years studying and reading constitutions, ancient and modern, and I didn't realize that I'd be the best equipped in the writing of the Constitution of anybody in the convention till I got there. And they all knew it inside of 10 days.
It was a humid Monday morning in Muskogee's Hinton Theater as the chiefs of the 5 great nations took their places upon the stage. At 11 o'clock, Chief Pleasant Porter called the Sequoyah Convention to order. There were 60 delegates and twice as many spectators.
The way it was organized was very, very fortunate. I mean, naming the committees that named subcommittees to deal with certain parts of their charges. Whether there was disagreement among the delegates at the convention doesn't come through in the reports, but for the most part, it was a fairly congenial group.
For 2 weeks, the individual committees worked on separate parts of the Constitution. There was a Bill of Rights, a section creating a corporation commission to protect citizens from predatory businesses, but left out was women's suffrage. Ladies of the new state would not have the vote.
The question of prohibition was central to the discussion of statehood. Indian Territory was dry, and of course, countless number of felons had been prosecuted in Fort Smith and other courts adjacent to Indian Territory for introducing liquor. And of course, Oklahoma was wet.
These tribes came from the Old South, and so many of the issues that the South fought for, states' rights, limiting federal authority, fear of big businesses, come into the Sequoyah Convention, make their way into the Oklahoma Constitution.
In order to secure the president's signature, a section establishing segregation was left out.
The people at Sequoyah Convention and at the Oklahoma Convention wanted to exclude African Americans from much of the privileges of citizenship. Roosevelt says, if you put that in the Constitution, I will not sign it. You will not become a state. So Alfalfa Bill Murray and those other leaders had to keep that out for him to sign it so we could become a state. Senate Bill number 1 filed in 1907 was the Jim Crow bill to separate the races.
Delegates signed the proclamation for the new Indian state on Friday, September 8th. The 35,000-word document was divided into 18 articles and 270 sections.
Our present government shall not be annihilated, but transformed into material for a nobly established state. Thus shall we have life, not death. Chief Pleasant Porter.
Remember, they started on the 21st of August, and they adopted that Constitution on the 8th of September.
It was a study in efficiency. It really was. And I don't know that they could have done a better job if they took years to plan it.
The convention itself unanimously ratified that Constitution. There were no votes in the Constitution against the. So you've got a fairly strong sense of the people who are involved in this movement that this is something that can be done.
As the convention drew to a close, delegates heard a few last words from Chief Pleasant Porter.
From time immemorial, the Indians, as a heritage of the original inhabitants, have been promised a state, an empire of their own. Driven west by successive invasions, the Indians were forced to settle in this territory, which is undoubtedly Indian country. They have taken on the dress, the customs, and the religion of the white man, and they welcomed him as a brother. The national government must grant us separate statehood or make a confession.
Once the Constitution was written, it was ratified by the convention. Then it had to be ratified by citizenry of this proposed state.
With the ratified Constitution in hand, Chief Pleasant Porter, Alexander Posey, Charles N. Haskell, William H. Murray, and 4 congressmen got on a train for Washington, D.C. to place the proposal on the president's desk.
After it adjourned, Haskell walked to the depot and he said, "Do you believe that we'll get statehood under this bill?" I said, "No." Why? Because the eastern fellows don't want 2 new states out there with 4 senators instead of 1. Well, don't you think it'll hasten statehood? To my regret, it will.
An editorial in the Muskogee Phoenix predicted that within 2 weeks after Congress convened in December, that the fight for separate statehood would be dropped.
Theodore Roosevelt knew what he wanted to do politically. House Speaker Joe Cannon, the iron-fisted Speaker of the House of Representatives, they knew collectively together what they wanted to do politically.
I want you to have statehood, but not for Oklahoma alone. I am with you for joint statehood for Oklahoma and Indian Territory, and I would also like to see New Mexico and Arizona come in as one state.
They knew that for them the fix was in. There was no chance of there ever being a state of Sequoyah. That they were going to see to it politically, and they knew where the votes were. They had the votes to keep it from happening.
In his 1906 address to Congress, President Roosevelt officially put an end to 100 years of dreams with one more broken promise.
I recommend that Indian Territory and Oklahoma be admitted as one state, and that New Mexico and Arizona be admitted as one state. There's no justification for further delay, and the advisability of making the 4 territories into 2 states has been clearly established.
The way was now clear for Oklahoma to become the 46th state in the Union. Arizona and New Mexico would become the 47th and 48th states in the years to come.
The state of Sequoyah is never accepted by Congress. It does not become law. But when the Constitutional Convention is called in 1906, those leaders have a head start. The Indian Territory would dominate the Constitutional Convention.
The Oklahoma Constitution, as it came from the Sequoyah Constitution, to me is the ultimate cut and paste job. They took essentially the most cogent elements of the Sequoyah Constitution and adapted it over to what we have now as the present state of Oklahoma Constitution.
I think 18 of the people who'd worked on the state of Sequoyah Constitution eventually ended up working on the Oklahoma Constitution. So it wasn't as if we did not participate. Ultimately, one recognizes that you cannot defeat what is already happening, and that in order to survive, the 5 civilized tribes have always sought ways that were legal.
At 10:16 on the morning of November 16, 1907, surrounded by newspapermen and a small delegation from Oklahoma, President Theodore Roosevelt signed the Statehood Proclamation, saying, "Oklahoma is now a state." It was a new beginning for the people of the Twin Territories and the end of a dream.
You know, if we had a state, and that's, you know, that's just kind of a wishful thing, if we did have a state, it might have been a lot different. I'm sure it would have been, but you'd probably still have a lot of, there's always your politicians.
If we had those seats and voice at the table in Congress, we could have pushed for acceptance or citizenship of the Native people. Of course, we weren't citizens as we volunteered for World War I. It wasn't until 1924, I believe, we became citizens.
There may have been a sense that history is bringing something to a close here, and we're trying to get the best bargain we can. If we're going to salvage anything, we've got to do this, whether we like it or not. That was true with allotment. And, you know, it was probably true with the statehood movement as well.